When I was 13, my life was shattered. My dad died in a car accident, and just months later, my mom lost her long battle with cancer. In the blink of an eye, I was alone. The state decided I was too young to take care of myself, so they sent me to a foster home, an old mansion tucked away in a hilly forest. It was a place where I thought I could maybe find some peace, but instead, I saw something much darker. The mansion looked like something out of an old movie, tall with creaky floors and surrounded by thick, dark trees. Mrs. Damsel, who ran the place, was the foster mother and teacher for all kids. 10 other kids were living there, but they were off. They barely talked, moved around like robots, and ate candy like it was the only food they'd ever known. Not just the occasional piece. I'm talking bowls and bowls of the stuff for every snack. Mrs. Damsel had a few servants who helped her keep the place running, but one of them, Carl, stood out like a sore thumb. He was this creepy 50-year-old guy who had no business being around kids. He never knocked before entering our rooms, and he had this unsettling habit of watching us during meals, his eyes lingering a little too long. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something wasn't right about the way Carl interacted with us. He'd pop up out of nowhere, scaring us in the halls, and he always seemed to know what we were doing, even when we were supposed to be alone. The other kids didn't seem to notice, or if they did, they didn't care. They were too wrapped up in those damn candies. One night, I woke up to the sound of muffled crying. I crept out of bed and followed the noises to Luna's room. Luna was one of the quieter kids, always keeping to herself. When I peeked through the crack in her door, I saw Carl standing over her, whispering something. Luna was shaking, tears streaming down her face.
No, please. Not that again. I don't want to do this.
If you don't do what I say, you'll never get the magic candies again, Carl hissed. Luna's sobs grew louder, but she nodded, clearly terrified. I felt a chill run down my spine. Something was seriously wrong. The next day, I started keeping an eye on Carl, trying to figure out what he was up to. It didn't take long to piece things together. I noticed how the kids seemed to almost worship the candy, how they'd do almost anything for it, even things that made no sense, like cleaning Carl's shoes or giving him back rubs. One evening, I followed Carl to the pantry where he kept the candy. I waited until he left and then snuck in. That's when I found it, a stash of pills hidden behind the jars of sweets. Carl was drugging us through the candies, getting us hooked. And when the addiction got bad enough, he used it to control us, to make us do disgusting things for him. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Carl was a pedo, and Mrs. Damsel knew it. She was too scared to do anything about it, so she let it continue. I was furious, terrified, and most of all, determined to stop him. That night, I gathered the other kids. They were confused at first, their eyes glazed over from the candy, but I showed them the pills and told them what Carl had been doing. Slowly, the realization dawned on them too. The fear turned to anger. When Carl came into the room, he didn't see it coming. We all jumped on him, hitting, kicking, and doing anything to make him stop. He screamed, but we didn't stop until Mrs. Damsel rushed in, horrified by the scene. For the first time, she did the right thing. She called the cops. Carl was arrested that night. The mansion shut down soon after. We were all sent to a hospital for 6 months to get clean and to try to forget the horrors we'd lived through. It wasn't easy. Some of the kids took longer than others, but we all made it through. Now, I'm grown. I've moved on, or at least tried to. But every year on my birthday, I get cards and gifts from the kids who were at the mansion with me. From my friends, because that's what they became. Friends whose lives I saved, and who, in a way, saved mine too. Life goes on, but those memories never really leave you. Every time I see a piece of candy, I remember what happened in that old mansion up in the hills. And every time I get one of those cards in the mail, I know that we all made it out. We survived, and that's what matters. I was just 11 when I first arrived at the Johnsons' house. I thought I'd finally found a real family. The house was perfect, like something out of a magazine. White picket fence, flowers lining the walkway, and a porch swing. Mrs. Johnson was always smiling, and Mr. Johnson was the kind of man who patted your head when you did well in school. I had heard that they had helped 4 kids before me, including Jules, with whom I had briefly shared a home with earlier. I was finally safe. We'd have family dinners every night with Mr. Johnson carving the roast while Mrs. Johnson asked me about school. They even gave me my own room. It was more than I'd ever had before. But then, the strange woman started coming. It was always the same. The doorbell would ring and Mrs. Johnson's smile would tighten just a little. They never let me see her, not at first. They'd shut the door behind them and all I'd hear was their muffled voices. The first time I saw her was by accident. I'd forgotten my math book downstairs and had snuck out of bed to get it. I peeked around the corner just in time to see her being led to a small broom cupboard under. She was Chinese, maybe in her late 30s with long black hair, but weirdly the Johnsons locked the cupboard from outside.
Why is that woman locked up in the room?
Mrs. Johnson's smile was back in place by the time she answered.
She's just a friend who needs some cleaning supplies. Don't worry, honey. Go back to your room.
I didn't believe her. Something about the way she said it made my skin crawl. The visits became more frequent. Every few days the woman would show up, and each time the Johnsons would lock her away in the cupboard for a few hours. It wasn't just that, though. I started noticing other things, little things that didn't add up. Mr. Johnson would disappear late at night, only to return with dirt on his shoes and clothes. Mrs. Johnson would get phone calls, and after hanging up, she'd look worried. One night, I overheard them arguing in the kitchen. "She's getting suspicious. We can't keep this up much longer."
She's just a child. She doesn't understand. It's too late to back out now. We need to see it through.
I didn't know what they were talking about, but I knew it wasn't good. Then, one night, I found the pictures. I went to Mr. Johnson's home office to get a stapler for my school project when I knocked over a stack of papers on his desk. As I picked them up, a few photos slid out from underneath. They were of children, boys and girls around my age or younger. Some of them were tied up. My hands shook as I shoved the photos back into the pile, but not before I saw the last one. It was of a Chinese woman sitting in the same broom cupboard that they always locked her in, only this time, she wasn't alone. There was a little girl with her, and I recognized her instantly. Jules. I knew then that something was terribly off. The next day, Mrs. Johnson told me to go clean the broom cupboard. I didn't think anything of it until I stepped inside and the door slammed shut behind me. I heard the lock click and I was plunged into darkness.
Let me out! Please!
But no one came. I don't know how long I was in there, but it must have been 2 to 3 days. I screamed until my throat was raw, but they didn't care. They would just give me food and water once in a day and kept a bucket beside me for me to relieve. And then, one night, the door opened. To my horror, it was the same mysterious Chinese woman. She didn't say a word, pulled out a marker, and wrote something in Chinese on my arms and neck before leaving. I had to think fast. There was nothing in the cupboard except for brooms, a mop, and a small toolbox. The toolbox. It took few hours to pry the nails out of the wooden panels, but it loosened the lock on the door, which finally gave way. I crawled out, covered in sweat and dirt, and then ran for the neighbor's house. When they opened their door, I burst into tears and told them everything. The police came soon after, and over the next month, a massive crackdown happened as the arrest of the Johnsons revealed a big human trafficking ring. They found the pictures, imprisoned the Chinese woman and her friends, and this scandal suddenly shook our small town. The Johnsons were arrested, but I still see their faces in my nightmares. I considered them close to my parents, not realizing that I was being groomed by them to be sold off. It's often the people with the warmest of smiles who have the darkest of hearts. When Jake and I were sent to live with Mrs. Hawthorne, we were told it was a fresh start, a chance to be part of a family again, to have a home in the countryside where the air was clean and the nights were quiet. I wanted to believe that, but the moment we arrived, something felt wrong. Mrs. Hawthorne's house was old, leaning under the weight of decades, surrounded by thick woods. The air inside was stale and marred with creaking floorboards. Mrs. Hawthorne greeted us with a strange smile. She was supposed to be old, with silver hair pinned into a tight bun and wrinkly arms, but her face looked young and radiant, as if she were 30. There were 3 other children there, which was odd since we were not told about them. They were quiet, their eyes downcast, moving like they were half asleep.
Jake, do you think they're okay?
They're just shy, Mia. We'll be fine. But as the days passed, I wasn't so sure.
At Vodafone, experience the epic Samsung Galaxy S24 and you can save a huge $500.
But as the days passed, I wasn't so sure. The house itself seemed alive, with doors that creaked open on their own and shadows that slithered across the walls. At night, I'd hear strange noises coming from the attic, scratching, like something was trying to claw its way out. The other children never talked about it, never even seemed to notice. But when I pressed one of the boys, Oliver, about it, he just told me to not talk about it, or the caregiver would know.
I'm sure she can't hear us.
That is when Oliver's face paled and he turned away, saying that the caregiver was not Mrs. Hawthorne. It was the first time I heard about the caretaker, but it wouldn't be the last. The other kids whispered about it when they thought no one was listening, but I caught fragments of their conversations. They believed the caretaker lived in the attic, that it controlled Mrs. Hawthorne, that it was the reason for all the strange things that happened there. Every night, Mrs. Hawthorne performed strange rituals. She'd light candles, dozens of them, and arrange them in a circle in the living room. She'd chant in a language I didn't understand, her voice rising and falling like the wind through the trees. The first time I saw it, I was frozen. Her rituals grew more bizarre. Her voice was more frantic. I rushed back, scared, but I noticed that the other children were suddenly getting weaker. They were pale, their eyes sunken, and they moved even slower than before. It was as if the life was being drained out of them. One day, I found an old photograph. It was of Mrs. Hawthorne standing in front of the house, but something was off. The photo was dated 1952, but Mrs. Hawthorne looked exactly the same. No wrinkles, no signs of aging, her skin still exactly the same. My heart raced as I realized that something strange was afoot. I looped in Jake, and that night we planned to see the attic. The candles were already lit, and Mrs. Hawthorne was in the middle of one of her rituals. Her chanting was louder, more frantic, and the house seemed to pulse with a dark energy. The shadows on the walls twisted and writhed, almost if they were alive. We waited until Mrs. Hawthorne was deep in her ritual, and then we snuck up. The attic door was locked, but we could hear something moving behind it. Jake was a god at breaking locks, and I gave him my hairpins.
Jake, hurry! We need to do this before she notices.
I'm trying, Mia. Just keep watch. And then it came undone. We went inside, amidst the darkness and the strange smell. Jake had brought a match, and as soon as he hit it, we saw a figure in the sparks. It wasn't human or an animal. It was easily over 10 feet tall and had red eyes. Before we could even get out of the jolt, I realized that the smell was of gasoline, and before I could stop Jake, he threw the almost burnt-out stick on the floor to pull out a new one. That was it. A terrifying blaze swept through the attic, and in the middle, we saw the demonic figure wail. We turned to run, but Mrs. Hawthorne was already there, her eyes pitch black and her mouth twisted into a snarl.
You think you can escape? You're mine!
Jake pushed me towards the stairs while he charged at her. Run, Mia! I'll hold her off! I resisted, but Jake pushed me down the stairs. I looked back just in time to see the black entity and Mrs. Hawthorne merge into one. Suddenly, huge claws grew out of her fingers as the fire surrounded her. The fire roared, consuming the attic, but it was too late. I ran to the other kids for help, but as I approached them, I stood in shock. They all had entirely pitch black eyes as well, and then it made sense why no one had told us about those kids earlier. They were all dead as well. As the fire took over the house and I heard Jake's screams, I cried and ran out for help. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest house. The neighbors called the cops, but by the time they got there, the house was nothing but ashes. They found the bodies of the other children buried in the ground behind the house, their eyes missing, but they never found Jake or Mrs. Hawthorne. It was as if they'd vanished into thin air. Everyone was afraid of believing in me till the bodies were found, but they had no explanations. I still remember it clearly, even after a decade, about what I saw that night. I just pray that Jake found his peace.